The winds on the hilltop whispered through the tall silver grass like ancient voices, telling stories to the stars, and Thyla stood there wrapped in her desert cloth, watching the lights of the refugee camp flicker below, and beside her Jace stood. Quiet arms crossed, breath calm, watching too, and the bondlings played near their feet, chasing each other, tumbling into the grass, their laughter soft and full of peace, and neither Thalen or Jace said anything because silence between them had never been empty, and the stars above were so bright now, brighter than she had ever seen them, as if the galaxy itself had begun to breathe again. Since the hub fell, since the chains broke, since the buyers lost power, and the sellers lost their hold, and the people remembered, they were more than numbers, more than property, more than fuel for profit, and she still remembered. How it all began, how her bondlings were dying, how no one cared, how she had begged and screamed and burned her voice raw, and no one had looked her way until a man with dust on his boots and a quiet in his soul had knelt before her and given away his last drop of water without asking for anything in return. And she turned to look at him, now at his jaw still scarred from the battle, at his arm that no longer straightened all the way, at the corner of his mouth, where the smile always started slow and small and real, and she reached for his hand and he took hers without needing to ask why, and together they walked back to the camp, past new walls being built, not to keep people out, but to keep the cold winds away, past gardens starting to grow with roots from Thula's homeworld and seeds from Earth, past children who called her mother even if not by blood, and warriors who bowed their heads to Jace even though he never asked for rank or title, past fires where stories were told in circles, stories of those still missing, still trapped, still afraid, and Thula knew the war was not finished, not truly, not while anyone still wore a collar or slept hungry or feared footsteps in the night. But she also knew it had changed forever, and she had changed too. She was not only a handler anymore, not only a survivor or refugee, she was a name now, a promise, a beginning, and Jace was no longer lost. He was no longer a drifter or a man with no place, because this was his place. This was their place, and later that night under the stars with the bondlings curled between them and the soft hum of the wind moving through the tent flaps, she spoke aloud the words she had hidden even from herself, the words that felt like rising suns in deep water, and she said, "I love you," and Jace, who had never said many things, who had always spoken more in silence than in sound, turned toward her and pressed his forehead to hers and said, "I loved you the moment you gave your last sip to your bondling, before you ever knew I had a drop left." And Thula closed her eyes and let the tears fall, not from sadness, but from everything else, from the years lost, from the hope returned, from the knowledge that even in a galaxy built on cruelty, love had found a way to grow, and days passed and turned to weeks, and more freed ships arrived, each one bringing new names, new faces, new stories, and every time Thala and Jace welcomed them with open hands and open hearts, and the pilot, who had once carried them away from fire, now led patrols in the outer systems, and the rebels had become something new, not just fighters but builders, and in the great hall carved from old stone, where they met to share news, Thala stood one day and announced her next plan. A network of sanctuary moons, a beacon system for escape ships, and Jace added a name for it in Old Earth, Tongue Haven, and they all agreed, and work began, and her people came from across the stars, not just her own species, but many, those once bought, those once broken, those once forgotten. Thyla walked among them, not like a queen, not like a leader, but like someone who understood, and they bowed to her, not because they were forced, but because they loved her, and still, every night she returned to Jace and their hill, and their tent and their fire, and they would sit in silence as the stars blinked. Above, and one evening long after the fire had died, Jace reached into his coat and pulled something out small and silver and smooth, and placed it in her hand, and when she looked down, it was a ring made from melted collar wire and old circuit stone. And he said, "I don't have fancy words or customs, but I have you, and if you'll stay, I'll stay." And Thela, who had once sworn she would never belong again, said only one word, yes, and the wind answered, and the stars shone brighter, and across the galaxy where her name was whispered, where his face was remembered as the one who knelt with water and hoped, their story became legend, not because they were perfect or powerful or chosen, but because they chose again and again to love when love was dangerous, to give when nothing was left, to rise when the world wanted them to fall, and even after years, when the camps had become cities and the bondlings grew old and stories turned to myth, the children still told it by fireside about the Bavave girl in chains and the man who stopped, and the drop of water that changed the stars. The stars were quiet after the blast, like the galaxy itself held its breath, unsure whether to mourn or celebrate, and inside this small stolen ship the silence was louder than the fire that had ripped the slaver hub apart, and Thela held Jace's wounded arm wrapped in soaked cloth, her hands steady, her breath shallow, her heart screaming because he had smiled as the world burned, and she had seen it in his eyes the moment he believed they had won, but also the moment he knew the cost. And she whispered words in her language, old prayers forgotten by most, but known to those who had once lived under suns with no mercy. And Jace smiled again, weak but real, and whispered, "I'm still here," and she nodded, though her eyes were wet and her hands wouldn't stop shaking, and the bondlings nestled between them like living warmth, and the pilot cursed at the controls, saying more ships would come, that someone out there had seen the fire and the static and would come to find who did it. And Thela looked to the stars and said, "Let them come," because her fear had died with that station, and in its place grew something else. Something older than fear, something that felt like fire and roots in storm, and she had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. And Jace whispered her name again, not a question, just a name, like it was the only word he trusted, and she leaned down and pressed her forehead to his and said, "I'm not leaving you," and he laughed, though it hurt him, and said, "Good, because I'm not letting go." And the ship moved through a hidden drift current, one only old smugglers remembered, and the pilot kept them off every radar like a ghost in the black, and they made it to a safe moon with no name and no light, where a resistance cell still burned low and raw. And when they stepped into the shadows, Jace bleeding and Thela fierce with the bondlings wrapped around her, the rebels saw not just survivors but symbols. And when Thala showed them what remained of the data, the backup plans, the buyer chains, the names behind the names, the rebels said yes without blinking, and the war turned that day, not all at once, not with armies or fleets, but with whispers, with fire in the cracks, with a human and a handler who had nothing and gave everything. And soon Thela found herself speaking not to Jace alone, but to others, to leaders, to broken voices that had waited too long for hope, and now saw it in her eyes. And Jace stood beside her, not in front, not behind, just there. And when he wasn't beside her, he was teaching others how to survive, how to fight, how to use what they had. And the bondlings became symbols to children in a way of what was being saved. And Thela found herself sleeping less and leading more. And one night, as she sat watching a new group of freed beings cry over their first meal, she felt a hand slip into hers and turned to find Jace with fresh stitches and tired eyes, and he said, "I'm not a leader, but I'll follow you anywhere." And she smiled and said, "I never asked you to lead. I just asked you to stay." And he nodded and kissed her knuckles and said, "Always." And the war did not end in a day or a cycle or even a year, but everywhere they went chains fell and names were erased. And voices rose and stories spread of the handler with fire in her blood and the human who walked into death with only a canteen and kindness, and soon even slavers began to tremble when her name was whispered, and systems once ruled by fear now lit beacons with her sigil, not as queen or ruler but as protector. And Jace stayed close, always fixing what he could, healing what he must, breaking what had to be broken. And Thala never let him out of sight, not because she was afraid, but because some part of her still remembered that day in the cage when she thought kindness was gone from the stars, and how he gave his last drop of water to save something small and forgotten. And one night she stood before a crowd of thousands, ex-slaves, warriors' children, and she told the story not of how she fought, but how she was saved. And the stars above that night seemed to blink slower, like they too were listening. And afterward Jace held her from behind, his arms around her waist, his mouth at her ear, whispering, "You saved me too." And she turned and said, "I know." And they didn't speak again for a while, because their hearts said what words never could. And in the days that followed they built not a kingdom, not an empire, but a home. Place where no one was forgotten, where no bondling went thirsty, where every voice mattered. And she often sat at the edge of the hill with Jace and watched the little ones play, and they would smile at each other, like maybe the war had not taken everything. And sometimes she would touch the old collar, now melted into a pendant, and he would touch the empty canteen, now worn on his belt like a badge, and they would say nothing because some memories were too sacred for speech. The darkness of the ancient chamber flickered with dim blue light from old panels. Jace managed to power up using broken converters and salvage cells, and Thala watched as the human who had once only handed her water now moved like a ghost through the forgotten systems, his hands quick, his breath steady, his eyes focused like a soldier, or maybe something older, maybe something broken and rebuilt stronger. And she didn't ask how he knew so much about the codes, the encryption, the slaver networks, the pirate transponders, because part of her already knew from the way his fingers shook when they cracked another registry, from the way his jaw clenched when another list of names appeared in front of him, names of children, names of mothers, names of thousands taken and sold and erased. And she saw it wasn't just a mission anymore. It was a reckoning, and she stood beside him not as someone who needed saving, but as someone who had survived, who had carried secrets through pain, who had hidden truth inside a collar. And she placed her hand on his and whispered, "Let's finish this." And he looked at her, not like she was fragile, but like she was fire, and said, "Together." And they worked through days and nights with no clear start or end. And the bondlings helped too, carrying wires, pulling cloth, bringing roots to chew when the silence grew too long. And even Malo, who once couldn't lift his head, now stood watch at the cave entrance, tail stiff, ears twitching. And when the last code was cracked and the location of the central slaver hub blinked red on the screen, Jace sat back and exhaled like he had been holding that breath for years. And Thala didn't smile, didn't cheer. She simply touched the blinking light and said, "We burn it." And Jace nodded and said, "We burn it all." And then he opened a case she hadn't seen before, long and black and hidden deep behind the broken console. And inside was a weapon, not large, not loud, but sleek and scarred with battles. And she realized then he hadn't come to the galaxy to trade or wander or escape. He had come to fight, and the fight had finally found him again. And she told him she would go too, and he tried to say no, not because he didn't want her, but because he was afraid. And she silenced him with a kiss, not a quick one, not a desperate one, but one that told him she had already chosen her path, and it led wherever he was. And he held her like the stars might fall, and she held back like gravity had no meaning. And then they planned not like amateurs, but like warriors. She showed him a back door known only to handlers, a supply channel masked as a wildlife preserve, where ships could pass unnoticed, and he mapped the timing and the rotations and the patrols. And she sent a message in a forgotten language to a name she hadn't spoken in years, and didn't know if they still lived. And 3 days later a ship responded, not big, not powerful, but fast and masked, and flown by a female with 4 arms, and a temper who looked at Thala like a ghost, and then hugged her without a word, and said, "I thought you were dead." And Thala said, "Not yet." And Jace stood silent as the 2 aliens embraced, and when Thala introduced him, the pilot sniffed and said, "This, the one you risked your codes for?" And Thala said yes, and the pilot nodded slowly and said then he better not waste them. And then they flew into the stars, not toward safety, but toward war, and the stars outside grew colder and harder, and Jace sat beside her, and the bondlings curled between them, and none of them slept, but no one complained. And when they reached the coordinates, it looked quiet, too quiet, and Jace didn't speak as he watched the scanners, saw no movement, saw no patrols, but he didn't trust it, and neither did Thala, so they moved low using the old canyons of the asteroid to slip close. And then they saw at the hub not a station, not a tower, but a nest, a sprawl of ships fused and tethered, floating like bones in the dark with lights blinking red and green and white. And at its center a pulse, a signal, a message sent out across the stars every few minutes. A beacon not for help but for buyers. And that was what they had to kill. Jace loaded the device they had, built from the old chamber parts, a virus, a bomb, a code meant to erase everything, not just the data, but the systems and the backups to the backups. And Thala guided him in with the pilot weaving between floating wrecks and dead satellites, and they landed under the cover of a cargo ship that hadn't moved in years, and slipped inside. And the halls were quiet, the air stale, but Jace kept moving, and Thala right behind him, and the bondlings hidden in her pack, too scared to stay behind but too small to leave, and they moved like shadows, like fire in dry grass. And then they reached the core, and Jace knelt and began the upload, and Thala stood watch, but it wasn't enough, because from behind the dark something moved. Metal feet, echoing, heavy boots, weapons charging, and Thala didn't think she acted. She grabbed Jace and rolled, and the shot missed, and then everything exploded into noise and fire and pain, and Jace was yelling, and Thala was firing, and the bondlings were screaming, and the slavers were shouting, and the code was still uploading, and all around. Then the hub was coming alive like a beast awakening, and Jace got hit in the arm, and Thala dragged him behind a console and pressed her hand to the wound. And he growled and said, "Keep going," and she said, "Not without you." And then the pilot's voice came through the comms yelling, "30 seconds, and Jace reached up and slammed the final key, and the virus went live, and the station howled a sound not of machines but of death. And they ran through the smoke and fire and screams. They ran holding each other, holding the bondlings, who clung to them like roots in a storm, and they jumped onto the ship as the pilot lifted off, and behind them the hub cracked and flared and then shattered into silent flame, and the stars blinked, and the message died, and across the galaxy the buyers heard only static, and the sellers screamed, and the chains began to fall. The tent was made of patchwork cloth, stitched together from many worlds, each panel a memory of trade, war, or survival, and inside it smelled of leather, spice, and desert. Wind the human moved with quiet purpose, arranging a soft bed from a travel mat, spreading out ration packs, not for himself but for the small creatures that now clung to her limbs, their fur still thin, their limbs still weak, but their eyes brighter than before. They chirped softly, snuggling into her warmth, and she breathed slow, trying to keep her tears hidden, though the human did not mock them. He simply worked like it was normal, like it was right. And for the first time since her capture, she felt her pulse steady, her limbs stop shaking. He offered her a cup of something. Hot, not water, but broth made from root plants, and she accepted it, cautiously sniffed it, and then sipped it, and it was bitter and warm and perfect. It didn't matter what it was. It mattered that he had offered it, that he had made it himself, that he had looked at her like a living being, not an asset, not a burden. She watched him from the corner of her eye, trying to guess what he was. What kind of human wandered into a flesh market and rescued an alien handler and her bondlings with no questions, no demands? He looked like a drifter, but his hands were steady, his posture balanced, his weapons not polished but clean, and the guards had listened to him, which meant he wasn't just another traitor. She wanted to ask, but didn't know the words in his tongue, and besides, the little ones were sleeping, finally truly resting, their tiny bellies full for the first time in days. And she didn't want to break the silence, but he spoke first, pointing to himself and saying a name, Jace, then pointing to her with a quiet question in his eyes, and she hesitated, then pressed her palm to her chest and answered in her own language, Thala, then touched each of her bondlings and spoke their names, to Nipa, Vairi, and Malo. He repeated them clumsily, but with care, and she smiled, the first true smile in weeks, and he smiled back, not wide, not arrogant, just enough to warm her chest and make the shadows outside the tent feel less threatening. Night was falling, the sky darkening to a deep blue with streaks of silver as the moons rose, and the slaver camp became restless with drunken laughter, clashing weapons, and cruel music. But inside the tent it stayed calm, and Jace unrolled another blanket and gestured for her to take it while he set up a simple perimeter alarm from an old beeper wire, and she realized then that he wasn't just rescuing her. He was protecting her too, and she couldn't understand why. She couldn't understand what made a human risk credits and reputation for someone like her, someone unwanted, someone enslaved. But he didn't act like she was a slave, and when she touched his arm lightly to thank him again, he froze just for a moment, like the touch had startled him or meant more than he expected, and she pulled back, but not in fear, and he didn't step away, and something changed. Then, not big, not loud, but real, like two puzzle pieces recognizing each other from across a broken table. She asked with her eyes what comes next, and he answered not with words but with a nod, and the next morning they were gone, not just from the tent, but from the camp entirely. He had bribed or bluffed his way past the patrols, and by the time the slavers realized she was missing, they were already 2 sectors away in a rust-colored shuttle that barely held together, but moved fast and quiet. She held her bondlings close as the ship bucked through jump space, and she looked at him again, really looked, and wondered what kind of man he was to risk so much for someone like her. But when she asked, he only said one thing: no one should watch someone they love die thirsty. And it hit her hard, not the words, but the way he said them, like he'd been there, like he'd lived it too. And now they were in orbit over a dead moon where he said no one would find them for now, and she didn't argue. She just followed him into a shelter half buried in stone, and there they made a new camp together, a temporary world where trust could grow. Her creatures healed slowly, their energy returning, their playfulness returning, and she began to speak more, using hand signs, body movement, broken trade tongue, and he listened. Always listened, never mocked. And one night, as she brushed the fur of little Vairi, who now bounced again with mischief, she looked over at him and asked why again, and this time he answered longer, told her about a desert on Earth, about a dog that had died in his arms because he had been too young, too scared, too far from help, and how he had promised himself he would never let another innocent die that way again. And she understood. Then he was not saving her for her sake or for pride. He was saving her to keep a promise to himself, to make the universe a little less cruel, and She wanted to tell him that he had done more than that he had saved not just lives but hope and something else. She didn't have a word for in her language, but it felt like the sky after a storm, or the first drop of rain on cracked soil. And when she sat beside him, their shoulders touching, he didn't flinch, didn't pull away, he just let it be, and it was enough for now because the warmth between them was real and rising, and something inside her dared to believe they were no longer alone in the stars. The days on the dead moon passed like slow-moving clouds over a desert sky, and each moment carved itself into Thala's memory as something between survival and something that might one day become home, and though she never called it that, and never dared believe it would last, she knew deep down that something had changed inside her, not just because her bondlings had begun to play again, chasing one another through the dust and shadows of the crater, not just because her heart didn't hammer every time she heard a sound outside the shelter, but because Jace was there, always watching, listening, repairing, patching, feeding, hunting. Even when he didn't speak, he said so much in the way he moved, in the way he offered her the first piece of cooked root, in the way he sat outside in the cold wind, so she and the little ones could sleep in warmth. And she found herself studying him more each day, not as a mystery, but as someone she wanted to understand, someone she needed to understand. And when she began to laugh again, really laugh at Malo stumbling into a pile of sand and chirping indignantly, Jace had looked at her with something soft in his eyes, and she didn't know what it was at first, but it made her chest feel light and heavy at the same time, like breathing for the first time after drowning. And when he asked her to teach him the names of her people, their words, their food, their sky, she felt something tighten inside her, not out of fear, but wonder. Because no one had ever asked her, that not even her own kind cared to ask. They only saw her as a handler, not as a person, not as a story, but Jace wanted to know her story, and slowly over weeks they built a language together, part spoken, part signs, part laughter. And when she showed him how to cook the blue root properly, without bitterness, he called it delicious and made a face when it was too spicy, and she laughed again, and each time they shared a meal, it felt less like surviving and more like living. And one night when the wind howled hard enough to shake the walls, and Vyri curled into her neck trembling, she turned to find Jace already building another layer of insulation around the door, his hands numb, his cheeks red from the cold, and she stood and helped him without needing to be asked. And when the work was done and the shelter sealed, she sat beside him and rested her head against his shoulder, and he didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't speak for a long time. Then very quietly, he leaned his head against hers, and in that silence, something was spoken between them, without any words. The next morning, she woke to find a small device beside her sleeping mat, a translator half-built, half-scavenged from ship parts, and he was tweaking the last wires with his tools. And when he noticed her awake, he smiled a little embarrassed and said, "Maybe we can talk for real now." And when she turned it on and spoke and heard her own words in his language echo through the tiny speaker, she laughed again, and then cried, and then he laughed too, and held her hand for the first time. Really held it, and she didn't pull away, she held back, and in that moment, the silence between them broke, and what flowed was not fear or caution, but stories, hers of her world, her people, her capture, and the long months in the cages. His of earth, of wars, of regrets, of a brother lost in fire, of why he had come out here to begin with. And when he told her that he had no home, no family, no reason to stay anywhere, she reached up and touched his face and told him that maybe now he did, and he looked at her like no one ever had, like she wasn't broken or weak or strange, but like she mattered. And when the bondlings climbed into his lap later and slept there twitching and warm, he didn't push them away. He curled around them like he had always belonged, and that night she sat beside him again, and this time, she leaned into his chest and felt his arm slide gently around her, and the warmth in his embrace was not just heat, but something older, something deeper, something like the first time. You feel safe after too long in the dark, and she wanted to stay there forever. But forever was a dangerous word because nothing in the stars lasted forever, and the next morning she saw the glint of something far away in the sky. A ship too distant for a regular scan, but she knew its shape. The outline of a tracker scout sent by slavers to find lost property, and her heart clenched and she didn't say anything until Jace noticed her staring and followed her gaze. And when he saw the shimmer, his jaw tightened and he said only one word, "We run," but she shook her head because she knew the kind of tracker it was, and they didn't run, they followed heat signatures and scent trails and bioscans, and the only way to lose them was to fool them, and so she led Jace to the caves deeper into the craters where the rocks were laced with old iron deposits and signal dampeners, and though the path was narrow and the bondlings clung to her, and Jace had to carry 2 of them at once, they made it by nightfall, and she used old tricks from her childhood to mask their presence, and he set traps and alarms, and they didn't sleep that night, just watched the scanner and each other. And when the scout passed overhead without stopping, they both exhaled at the same time and laughed breathlessly and fell into each other's arms, not from passion but relief. And still they didn't pull apart, because now pulling apart felt like tearing something important, and she whispered thank you again, not just for saving her or her bondlings or even her body, but for giving her back her voice, her smile, her courage. And he said nothing, just pulled her tighter, and she thought maybe she had fallen in love with this strange, quiet man who had once walked into a slave market and given his last drop of water to save something no one else had seen as worth saving. The caves were deep and strange and full of echoes and forgotten silence, and for a while it was enough to keep them hidden and safe and quiet. But the deeper they went, the more Thala began to feel the memories of the zone itself, like the place had once held others like them, fugitives, lovers, protectors, wounded beings who had crawled here to escape the outside world. And even though it was cold and damp and the roof sometimes rained tiny drops of water from old mineral veins, it became a kind of home, and the bondlings adjusted quickly, making little nests from discarded cloth pieces and dried moss Jace had found near the vent shafts, and they chirped and purred and played again. And the smallest one, Malo, who had once been too weak to stand, now climbed all over Jace's back when he wasn't looking and squeaked proudly like a conqueror, and Thala laughed until she couldn't breathe, and Jace looked over with that grin that always started small and turned wide only when he saw her happy, and it became a rhythm of days, hiding, scavenging, repairing, training, teaching, and each moment she saw how much he cared, not just for her, but for them, for the way he let Virai chew on the straps of his pack without scolding, for the way he quietly cleaned out Pa's eye when dust made it swell, for the way he always checked that Thala had eaten before touching his own food, and he never said it, but she knew he had begun to ration even more, just so they would not go without. And when she tried to share, he refused, gently, firmly, always shaking his head and saying you first, and she knew what that meant. She knew it was his way of saying I would die before I see you suffer, and it hurt and healed her heart at the same time. And one night she couldn't sleep, not because of fear, but because of what was growing inside her, something like fire and wind and hope, something she didn't dare name because naming it made it real, and real things got taken away. So she watched him in the dim light, his chest rising and falling slowly, his face peaceful in a way it never was during the day, and she reached out with trembling fingers and brushed his hair from his forehead, and he stirred but didn't wake, and she whispered something in her language, something old, something sacred, something that meant, "I see you, and I choose you." And the next morning she made him tea from a root she had saved for weeks, and he smiled, like it was the best thing he had ever tasted, even though it was bitter and dry. And she didn't correct him, because it was not about taste, it was about sharing. And then the storm came, not a storm of wind or water, but sound engines, rumbling above the crater, boots on stone, shadows moving fast and hard. And she froze, and he grabbed the little ones, one in each arm, and tossed her the pack and the weapon. And they ran deeper into the cave and found the old shaft she had only guessed was a tunnel. And they squeezed through and slid down a broken path of gravel and roots and metal, and the air grew tight and foul. But they didn't stop, they kept going, even when the light faded, even when Vire cried out, even when her leg twisted against a rock and her whole body screamed. She kept going, and he kept looking back, reaching for her, calling her name again and again, and she followed because his voice was the only thing keeping her upright. And finally they fell into a chamber, a hidden place with old tech lining the walls, and broken screens and dust thick on everything. And for a moment it was silent, and then Jace moved quickly, sealing the tunnel behind them with a burst charge and pressing his ear to the wall, and they waited breathless and shaking until the sounds above faded and the cave fell silent again, and they sat there in the dark, their chests heaving, their bodies pressed close, their arms around the bondlings who whimpered in confusion. And she whispered calming words into soft ears, and he held a torch low and said, "We're safe for now." And she knew what that meant, not forever, not truly, but enough. And that was all they had ever been given. And when they finally slept, it was in a pile of limbs and warmth and exhaustion. And when they woke, they began to explore and found old supplies left by someone long gone, a traitor maybe, or a rebel. And the food was stale but edible, and the water was clean. And for the first time in weeks, they were not running. And she told him then her full name, her title, her home, and he looked at her with quiet awe and said, "You're a noble." And she nodded and said, "I was." And he said, "You still are." And she couldn't speak after that, and just leaned into him, and he kissed her forehead without a word, and it meant more than any ceremony or ritual or vow. And the bondlings chirped and bounced between them, sensing the change. And that night they made a plan, not just to hide, but to find a way to fight back, not for revenge, but for freedom, for her, for them, for anyone still trapped behind bars. And she showed him old codes hidden in the collar they had ripped from her neck, and he cracked them with trembling fingers and saw what she had been carrying all along, not just data, but proof, coordinates, shipment logs, buyer names, routes, and destinations, enough to burn the whole slaver network from the inside. And she watched his eyes harden and his hands steady, and he said, "We're going to end them." And she said, "We," and he said, "Always." And they stayed there one more night and held each other tight, because they knew once they moved again, everything would change again. And this time, they were not just running, they were rising, and the stars above were about to remember their names. Everyone walked past her cage like she was invisible, just another alien in chains, begging for mercy. Her pets were weak, barely breathing, their little eyes dry from thirst, but no one cared. They laughed at her cries until one man stopped, just a human carrying a single canteen, and when she begged for help, she never expected him to give everything he had, even his last drop of water. What happened next changed both their fates forever, and her enemies would regret the day they let that human walk free. The heat in the auction cages was unbearable, the air thick with dust and sweat and despair. The alien female curled around her companions, small creatures with translucent fur and long feathery ears, their little chests rising and falling too slow, their mouths open But no sound coming, no water, no hope. The auctioneers had thrown her into the slave pens after capturing her ship, claiming she was nothing special, just another exoclass handler from the desert moons of Ralakan. But she wasn't. Here for herself, she didn't care what they did to her. All she wanted was water for her babies. They weren't children, not to humans, not to the traders, but to her. They were family's soft-souled companions who had bonded to her since birth. Her heartbeat matched theirs, and as they withered under the twin suns, she felt like her own lungs were collapsing. She cried out through the bars, her voice cracking, her tongue thick like sandpaper. She offered jewels, data codes, secrets. She begged, she pleaded, she promised, even swore blood rights. None of the passing bidders cared. They saw the animals as pests and her as worthless. The slavers mocked her, said she should cook them if she was hungry. Some threw trash, others offered to buy her butt, demanded the creatures be killed first. Then came the human. He wasn't like the others, no uniform, no entourage, just a lone man with a dirty coat, boots scuffed from travel, and a canteen strapped to his hip. He paused in front of her, his face shadowed under his hood, his eyes locked on the dying creatures. His mouth didn't move for a long moment. She didn't expect anything different. She had given up hoping, but then he stepped forward. The guards moved, but he raised a hand, and they stopped. Maybe it was his reputation. Maybe they just didn't care. He knelt in front of the bars, slowly unscrewed his canteen, and held it out, not to her, but to the smallest of her pets, the one too weak to lift its head. She gasped a whisper of disbelief, and the creature instinctively leaned forward. Its tongue flicked once, then again, and then it drank slow, gentle sips, and she saw life return to its tiny eyes. Tears welled in her own. She reached through the bars, cupping her hands as he passed the canteen to her, letting her pour just enough for each one to taste. He didn't speak the whole time. He just watched their reactions and hers with quiet focus. And when the canteen was nearly empty, he raised it to his lips, looked at her once more, and then tilted it. The last drops he poured into her hands, not his mouth, not even for himself. She stared at him, stunned. She had known kindness before, but never like this, not in captivity, not from a species that didn't even know what her creatures were. He stood to leave, but before he did, he looked to the guard and said something she couldn't hear. The slaver frowned, but nodded, then walked away. The human turned back to her, and for the first time she saw his face, not hidden, shaded. His eyes were tired but kind, his mouth bent in a small soft smile, and then he walked off just like that, gone, but not really, because the guards returned moments later, unlocked the cage and dragged her out. She thought they were going to beat her for speaking, for wasting water, but instead they took her to the back toward a side tent, and when she looked up again, the human was waiting inside. He didn't say anything, still just nodded and motioned for her to enter, and that was when she realized he had bought her not for labor, not for pleasure, not even for information, just for them, the little ones now stirring, now blinking, now breathing again. And she fell to her knees, not because she was weak, but because her heart didn't know what to do with so much kindness given so freely. She clutched the smallest creature to her chest and whispered thank you over and over, her voice cracking, her body trembling, and the human knelt beside her, reached out, and gently wiped the dirt from her cheek, his fingers warm, his eyes full of something she couldn't name yet. And that was the beginning, not of debt, not of ownership, but of something rarer than water in the desert, of kindness in a cruel world, and neither of them knew it yet. But that one act would ripple through galaxies and paint their names into legends. If you believe humanity always finds a way, subscribe for more HFY Sci-Fi stories that prove it.